Most people think life begins the day they're born, but truthfully, that's just the start of your existence, not your life. There's a moment that comes later, sometimes quietly, sometimes through chaos, when something inside you wakes up, a fracture in the noise, a moment of pause so deep it scares you. And in that space, for the first time, you're not living by momentum. You're aware. That's when life actually begins. Until that point, you're mostly just following instructions you didn't write. You become who you're told to be. You pursue what you're told to want. You live inside a blueprint designed by family, culture, school, media, all without ever asking, is this even mine? And then something happens. A crack in the pattern. Maybe it's a breakdown. Maybe it's a loss. Maybe it's just a quiet day where you finally hear yourself think. And what you hear doesn't match the life you're living. That's the turning point, the Nietzsche moment, where you begin to peel off the layers of should and supposed to, and start confronting who you actually are beneath all of it. Most people avoid this because real life, the real you, doesn't come with a script. It's raw, uncomfortable, unfiltered, but it's also free. And once you feel that freedom, even for a second, there's no going back. You can't pretend anymore. You can't numb it out. You can't force yourself to fit into roles that never felt right. Because that moment, that awakening, flips something in you. The false self begins to die. And what replaces it, that's where your real life begins. You don't wake up one day and suddenly become your true self. It's not that clean. It's more like unlearning, slowly, everything that was never really you. And that process doesn't feel like a movie montage. It feels like confusion, like discomfort, like standing in a room full of your old beliefs and realizing none of them fit anymore. That's the strange part no one talks about. When your real life begins, it doesn't always feel like a celebration. Sometimes it feels like grief, like you're watching the version of yourself you've performed for years start to dissolve. And even though it was never real, you still feel the loss, because letting go of the false self means stepping into the unknown. And the unknown is terrifying. But here's where it gets real. Growth doesn't come from adding more. It comes from shedding what no longer serves. The roles, the routines, the borrowed values. At first, this feels like failure. You're not as motivated by the same goals. You're not as reactive in the same conversations. You start pulling away from people who once felt like home, not out of anger, but because you're outgrowing the version of yourself they were attached to. And that's when the doubt creeps in. You start wondering if something's wrong with you. You question whether this awakening is just burnout or confusion. But if you stay still long enough, if you stop trying to fix the discomfort and just sit with it, a new kind of clarity emerges. It doesn't shout, it doesn't rush, it's just there, like a whisper beneath the noise saying, "You're not lost, you're just becoming." Real life doesn't begin when you have it all figured out. It begins when you stop pretending to, when you allow the truth, raw, unpolished, inconvenient, to show itself in your decisions, your silence, your boundaries. It's when you no longer seek to be understood by everyone, because you're finally beginning to understand yourself. And that understanding, that's the beginning of a life that's truly yours. You start to notice something strange once that shift begins. The world doesn't change. You do. The way you see it, the way you feel it, the way you respond to it. The same conversations feel different. The same ambitions you once clung to now feel hollow. You find yourself questioning things you never paused to question before. Why do I care so much about being liked? Why am I chasing this goal that doesn't fulfill me? Why am I still trying to impress people who don't even see me? These questions come like waves, not to drown you, but to clean you, to strip away what was never authentic, and it's not always dramatic. Sometimes, the most important part of awakening is subtle. It's in the way you stop defending yourself in arguments that no longer matter. It's in the way you take a deep breath before reacting. It's in the way you recognize your own patterns and gently choose something else. This is what Nietzsche was pointing at when he said real life begins. It's not about external success or spiritual perfection. It's about becoming conscious, waking up to your own programming and no longer being a passive character in your own story. But here's the part no one prepares you for. The more conscious you become, the lonelier it might feel at first. Because as your truth deepens, the masks around you become harder to tolerate. Shallow conversations start to drain you. Loud environments feel like static. Forced smiles feel like lies. Not because you're judging others, but because you're finally in touch with something real. And it makes everything fake feel unbearable. So you start walking a quieter path. Not out of pride, but out of protection. Not isolation, just space. Space to hear your own voice without all the interference. Space to rebuild without rushing. Space to ask, deeply and honestly, what kind of life would I live if I stopped performing altogether? That's when it really begins. That's when the old timeline collapses, not because it was wrong, but because you've outgrown it. You begin to live in a way that doesn't require outside permission. You stop chasing moments and start creating them. You stop seeking direction and start becoming it. And for the first time, you're not surviving the day. You're actually living it. Once you stop living on autopilot, you begin to realize how much of your life was driven by fear. Fear of disappointing others, fear of not being enough, fear of falling behind some invisible timeline. You realize how many of your choices were really just reactions. How many of your ambitions were actually survival strategies? How often you said yes when everything in your body was screaming no. That's the haunting part of becoming aware. You start seeing clearly, not just the world, yourself, the roles you played, the masks you wore, the lies you told just to keep the peace. And at first, it's uncomfortable. It's not pretty, because real clarity doesn't flatter your ego. It exposes it, and when that illusion cracks, the truth rushes in. But this is also where things get interesting, because once the old identity breaks apart, you're left with something rare, possibility. You begin to understand that who you were is not who you have to continue being. That every version of you up until now was just a story you told to survive. But now, you're free to write something new. Not a character built on fear, but one built on truth. Not a life built on expectations, but one built on alignment. And alignment feels different. It's quieter. There's less noise, less chasing. You don't need the world to clap for you anymore. You're not performing. You're living. And that difference, that shift from doing to being, is everything. You no longer wake up just to check off boxes. You move with intention. You speak with honesty. You rest without guilt. You begin to trust the timing of your life, not because it always makes sense, but because you've stopped needing to control every outcome. And in that trust, life meets you in ways it never could before, because now you're finally present. You're no longer fighting the current. You're learning how to float, how to breathe, how to let the moment be enough without squeezing it for more. This is where your real life starts to take shape, not in a rush, not in a grand announcement, but quietly, day by day, in how you choose to show up, fully, honestly, freely. There's a moment after all the noise has faded when you realize you're no longer trying to become someone. You're finally just being, not chasing a label, not reaching for the next upgrade of yourself. You're no longer obsessed with fixing everything, because for the first time, you understand that wholeness isn't something you achieve, it's something you uncover. You stop measuring your worth by productivity. You stop calculating your value by how many people approve of you. You stop letting failure define your identity. These are the chains that kept you locked in survival. And when they fall off, slowly, quietly, you feel a kind of power that doesn't need to prove itself. You start doing things because they feel right, not because they'll get applause. You say no without over-explaining. You sit with yourself in silence and don't rush to fill the space. You start caring less about looking wise and more about being honest. You listen more. You defend less. You move with fewer words, but more truth behind everyone. And here's what's wild. Life responds. People sense the shift. You begin attracting conversations that nourish you. Opportunities show up in unexpected ways. Not because you're hustling harder, but because you're radiating clarity. You're no longer a signal full of static. You're tuned in. This is what it means to live with intention, not perfection. You don't suddenly become immune to doubt or fear or pain. But now, you meet those emotions differently. You don't run from them. You don't let them steer the wheel. You sit with them, listen, and let them pass. And then you move forward, calmly, confidently, on your own terms. Real life isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with flashing signs or dramatic turning points. It unfolds in the choices you make when no one's watching. It reveals itself in how you treat yourself when you fail, in what you do when things don't go your way, in how you speak to yourself in the quiet moments of uncertainty. And the more you lean into that, the more you trust that this slower, more honest rhythm is not a step back, but a step into something real. The more everything begins to align around that truth. Not all at once, not in a perfect straight line, but steadily, like sunrise, slow, soft, unstoppable. There's a certain clarity that only comes when you stop trying to fix every crack in your life, when you stop obsessing over whether everything is right and begin asking something much simpler. Is this real? Is the way I speak, the way I live, the way I carry myself actually true to me? It's a shift so subtle that most people miss it, because it's not about self-improvement anymore. It's about self-remembrance, about returning to something you buried long ago under expectations, pressure, and noise. And the more you remember who you were before the world told you who to be, the less interested you become in pretending. You don't need to appear strong all the time. You don't need to have answers for everything. You don't need to project certainty in a world that's built on change. Real life isn't about looking like you've figured it all out. It's about learning to stand still in the not knowing without crumbling. And from that stillness, something rare begins to grow. Trust. Not blind faith, not hope based on fantasy, but a quiet, grounded trust in your ability to face what comes. Because now you're not operating from panic. You're not living from urgency. You've let go of the need to grip so tightly. The irony is, when you finally loosen that grip, the right things become easier. Not because life suddenly becomes effortless, but because you stop resisting the flow. You stop overthinking every turn. You stop needing a guarantee before taking a step. You realize that most of what you feared wasn't the future. It was your own doubt about whether you could handle it. But now you know you can. And that changes everything. You begin moving with a different energy, a quiet confidence, a gentleness in your tone, a calm in your presence. You don't walk into rooms trying to prove your value. You just are. And that kind of presence, the one that's grounded, self-aware, and unforced, is rare. It's magnetic. It doesn't demand attention, but it shifts the room anyway. Because you're no longer trying to be anything. You're finally allowing yourself to exist as you are. And in a world full of masks, that's the most powerful thing you can do. At some point, you realize that the version of you who was always trying to keep it together was never meant to carry all that weight alone. You were never meant to force your way through life. You were meant to meet it, to participate in it, to become through it. And now that you've seen a glimpse of what that looks like, now that you've felt what it's like to live from truth instead of tension, the old way just doesn't feel worth it anymore. And maybe you don't have all the answers. Maybe you're still in the middle of it, still peeling away the layers, still finding your voice, still healing old wounds. That's okay. No one said this path would be easy, but it's real. It's alive. And that's what matters. Because real life doesn't happen on the surface. It doesn't happen when you're pretending. It doesn't happen in your highlight reel. It begins in the quiet, in the questions, in the small moments where you choose honesty over habit. This, right now, could be the moment everything changes for you. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but quietly, subtly, internally. A shift that begins not with a plan, but with a choice. To stop performing, to stop forcing, to start listening, and to start living a life that actually feels like yours. So if something in you resonated with this, even just a flicker, don't brush it off. Don't scroll to the next thing and let this moment fade. Sit with it. Let it stay a little longer. Let it echo. And when you're ready, drop a comment below. Let this space be your marker, your beginning, a signal to yourself that you're not going back to autopilot. Just write, "I'm ready," or whatever feels honest to you, not for views, not for attention, but as a reminder to yourself that this moment mattered. And if you felt this video speak to something real inside you, subscribe, not just to catch another upload, but to walk this path with presence, with intention, and with truth. Because your real life doesn't begin when everything's perfect. It begins when you stop hiding, and today could be that beginning.